You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
Welcome into the Psych with Mike Library. This is your host, Dr. Michael Mahan, flying solo today because Mr. Brett Newcomb is actually on a travel day. He is returning from the Great White North with his beautiful bride and will be with us again next week in studio, and we are looking forward to that. I wanted to get an episode out today because we try and put an episode out every Friday, but also we've been having some technical difficulties here in the Psych with Mike studio, and the last couple of weeks I've been trying to get out some material so that we could get an episode out every Friday, but I finally got those issues resolved, and so I wanted to get something new out, as much to test the new equipment as to get something out to the audience. But the stress that I've experienced as a result of these last couple of weeks has been pretty intense. And so I thought to myself, what better subject, what better topic to cover on Psych with Mike than stress, because a lot of us probably don't really think about stress, or maybe we think about stress too much, but we don't always recognize what is the difference between stress and anxiety, and how can I control my stress, manage it better, or control my anxiety and manage that better. So to be able to understand how to be able to manage those things more effectively, we have to first be able to understand what the difference is. So the simplest definition of stress is any event, anything that puts an organism in a position to change. So is it more stressful to go to work every day to a verbally abusive boss, or is it more stressful to learn how to water ski? And the answer is, according to the clinical definition of stress, it's more stressful to learn how to water ski. I have to learn more new things. I'm put in a greater position of change by learning how to water ski than to go to work every day to a verbally abusive boss. But a lot of us would experience the verbally abusive boss as more stressful, and the reason for that is because we ruminate on the situation with our boss. And rumination is the foundation of cognitive dissonance, the inability for the human brain to comfortably hold two conflicting thoughts. And so when I ruminate on something, when I think about it over and over again, especially in a negative way, then I'm creating a lot of cognitive dissonance, and I experience that as anxiety. And so I experience that as a less desirable situation, going to work every day to the verbally abusive boss. But for the learning how to water ski, the clinical definition, that's actually putting me in a greater position of change, and hence is more stressful. So there is good stress and there's bad stress, but just stress as an entity itself is anything that puts you in a position to have to change. And so a good example of a stressful situation is somebody pulls off or cuts you off in traffic, and this happens really, really fast, and all of a sudden, bang, you are in a position to have to change. I have to do something to avert an accident, to slow my car down, whatever it is, and that triggers what is called the general adaptive syndrome. And the general adaptive syndrome is something that was first talked about by a guy named Hans Selye back in the 1950s, and he talked about this idea of the general adaptation syndrome and what it is and how it affects our body. And what happens is that when somebody cuts me off in traffic, I perceive that as potentially a life-threatening situation, something that I have to respond to. I have to somehow change my behavior, and I may have to do that very, very quickly. And that's called the alarm or reaction phase. So when I'm first see this person pulling over and I have to do something to be able to avoid the accident, to be able to avoid the collision, that is a fight or flight response reaction. So my body changes in very real physiological ways in reaction to this situation that is occurring in my life in real time. And so my body doesn't want to be in this situation of heightened awareness, heightened vigilance, heightened alertness. My body wants to return back to what's called homeostasis or balance. And so right after the alarm stage happens, my body wants to get into what's called the resistance stage, where it starts to heal and starts to return back to balance and homeostasis. But sometimes the alarm stage is protracted, like if we're responding to a natural disaster like a hurricane or the collapse of the tower in Miami. When those kinds of things happen, I may be in the alarm phase for a protracted period of time. And if that happens, if I'm in this alarm stage for a long period of time, then my body is going to burn through all of the resources that it uses for fuel, and it's going to start eating into the resources that my body uses to build itself. So instead of burning sugars in my bloodstream for fuel, it's going to start burning my muscle tissue. And that's a really, really bad place for us to be, is when this alarm stage lasts long enough and we're in a hyper state of alertness or hypervigilance for a long period of time, then we never really enter into the resistance phase. I never return to homeostasis, and I reach the stage of exhaustion where I'm going to literally collapse because I don't have anything left. And so one of the things that is beginning to be recognized more completely, more regularly by medicine in our society is this idea of adrenal fatigue, where I've been in this state of hyper awareness for such a long period of time. I've been activating the mechanisms that give me the ability to fight or fly, that now my body is just completely burned through all of the resources that give me energy, and it's starting to break down. And this is really important because we talked a couple of weeks ago about hypervigilance, and when you exist in this state of hypervigilance for a long period of time, that can actually have really, really negative physiological consequences. People who exist in a state of war for a long period of time suffer both psychological but physiological negative reactions or negative consequences because of that hyper state of alertness. But a lot of us put ourselves in that position. So some people think that, wow, if I'm in this state of hyper vigilance, that's a positive. That makes me a type A personality. I'm a go-getter. I can do a lot more than the competition. While that may be true for a short period of time, over a long period of time, that actually is going to have a lot of really, really negative consequences. Even if for years you're able to function in hypervigilance and outdo the competition, what's going to happen is that's going to cause your sleep cycles to be messed up. You're not going to get enough of what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, this kind of sleep where you dream, and your body's not going to break down the neurotoxins in your brain, and you're going to start having some real cognitive impairment. So dementia and eventually Alzheimer's disease can be linked to sleep disorders. When people don't sleep regularly, or they don't sleep well, they don't get good quality sleep, then eventually over time the negative consequences of that builds up and you start to have cognitive impairment. That's why things like sleep apnea are so important for people to go out and get checked out, because if you don't sleep well, if you're waking yourself up all of the time, whether you're aware of that or not, you're not going into REM sleep, and that toxic state builds up and gets worse and worse and worse, and eventually leads to negative impacts on your ability to think clearly. But another thing that I have seen, and seen pretty consistently when I worked in schools down in the inner city of St. Louis, there were a lot of kids there who lived in really, really dire circumstances. They didn't have a place to live, a regular place to live, or they were moving frequently, or there was a lot of trauma that they experienced in their home life. And they would come to school in this perpetual state of hypervigilance. And the school looks at that individual and labels them as behaviorally disordered. So they are called problem children, and they're not looked on as favorably in the school setting because they detract from the ability to run an efficient classroom. Now, the problem with that is that this state of hypervigilance is not these kids' fault. And when they get labeled as problem children, that only helps to reinforce the idea that they're bad, and then they grow up believing that because no one is doing anything to try and correct what is a problem that is not their fault. So what I always wanted to do, what I always encourage the school to do, is to recognize this state of hypervigilance and to try and give these kids the tools to be able to recognize that this was not their fault. Now, does that mean that that's going to potentially impact your ability to teach those kids? It very well may. But in my opinion, it's much more effective for the child for them to feel a sense of safety and security than it is to learn something. And once they start to feel safe and secure, they're probably going to be able to learn and maybe even catch up to their peers. But I know that that's a struggle for the schools. But the bottom line is this state of hypervigilance is not their fault. It's a result of the environment that they live in that they don't have any control over. But if I'm in this state of activation, this alarm state, this hypervigilance state, for a long period of time, I experience exhaustion. What I need to do is to try and do things that are going to bring me back into balance, back into homeostasis. And those are things that you probably have heard of before: deep breathing, any kind of thing that you do that is self-care, whether that's take a hot bath, read a book, play a video game, whatever it is that works for you. So things that I really enjoy doing: I like going snow skiing, I like scuba diving, I like building models. Those things help me to recharge my batteries. That brings me back to a state of balance and homeostasis. But it's important that we do those things. And sometimes people feel like, oh, I'm being selfish if I engage in self-care. And that's actually kind of ridiculous, because you're not doing anybody any good when you're in the exhaustion stage. You are actually causing a depletion of resources both inside your own body but also on a societal level, because eventually you're going to break down, you're going to collapse, and then you're going to either have to be treated medically or whatever, but you're not going to be able to contribute. So think of it in terms of, if you are responding to a fire and you're a fireman and you really want to go and save lives and put out the fire, which is fantastic. I have such high esteem for firefighters. But if you get to the point of exhaustion and you literally fall down and can't move, you're no longer able to save a life or to fight that fire. So it's important for people to monitor themselves. And if they're able, I understand there could be certain situations where it isn't an option. You just have to try and do what you have to do. But most of the time, we can monitor when we feel like we're coming up against that point of exhaustion, and then do something to try and recharge the batteries. So for some of us, right, if you're working outside and it's really hot and you're sweating profusely, and eventually you start to feel a little bit sick, you might start to feel nauseous, right? And that's a sign. Your body is giving you a sign that you are approaching that state of exhaustion. And then you need to go and drink some Gatorade, or even better, some Pedialyte. And I was having a conversation about this with a client not too long ago. They said, oh, drinking Pedialyte. And I said, oh, Pedialyte is horrible. But then I thought about it and I thought, oh, well, we give that to kids when they're ill, right? And I know that Pedialyte now has really made an effort to try and market itself as a sport drink. And I looked into it, and actually Pedialyte is exactly what we should drink, right? Gatorade has a lot of sugar in it and things like that, and things that really don't help our body. But Pedialyte really does replace the electrolytes and is one of the best things that you can drink. If you can stomach it, then drinking Pedialyte could be the best thing that you could do if you were working outside and you were sweating a lot and you started to feel nauseous. But you've got to do something to recharge those batteries. Take a break, right? Try and cool off, go inside, drink some water, drink some Pedialyte. But in our everyday lives, we have to make sure that we are engaging in a regular process of self-care. It isn't selfish to do self-care. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it's altruistic. If you get to a point of exhaustion where you're experiencing fatigue and burnout, burnout is actually a part of this exhaustion stage, then you're not contributing back to the greater good. And so you actually will have more to give back to society and your community if you are monitoring yourself and engaging regularly in self-care. So in reality, it's selfish not to engage in good self-care, because then you are taking yourself out of the ability to productively contribute back to your community. So whatever it is for you, and it's important for you to think about that and to make sure that you understand what recharges your batteries and giving yourself permission to engage in that activity regularly so that you make sure that you're not in a perpetual state of hypervigilance. Okay, I hope that that was educational for everybody. As always, the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin Declue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.